Coming up on Garden Talk.
And you want to get more purple, then so first thing you'll do is F2. You'll take a sister and a brother, you'll put them together, and that'll be your F2, and then F3 on the next sister brother, and that's filial breeding all the way down. Sister brother, just straight. But the word stable, when it comes to saying seeds are stable, means that they come out like a monoculture, that 99% of the traits that they display, they almost look like clones. All the progeny, you can get them all down to being all ruderalis after a couple of generations of breeding or a few generations. But to get it down to all them being ruderalis, you'll never get the purple. It'll always be recessive against. So you can take a male and stress it out and run it long enough, and it will throw female pistils and flowers and seed itself. And all of your seeds that come from that male will be maleized.
What's up, everybody? If you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 23. In this episode, I interview VaderOG. He is the founder of Ocean Grown Genetics and has been breeding for over 15 years. He grows a variety of plants such as cucumbers, tomatoes, herbs, orchids, banana trees, fig trees, avocado trees, citrus trees, and so much more. Vader also has a YouTube channel where he has nearly 80,000 subscribers, and he's been uploading videos for the past 10 years, so he's definitely an OG on YouTube. In this episode, we talk about the basics of breeding plants, everything from the nomenclature all the way to how to make different types of seeds. Thank you to all the supporters on Patreon who contribute to this information being made available for free on YouTube and podcast platforms. If you'd like to support, the link is patreon.com/MrGrowIt, and there are different tiers on there that unlock various rewards. Another big supporter of free information is our sponsors. Let's give a quick shout out to them. First up is Spider Farmer. Spider Farmer is well known to produce high quality LED grow lights at a price lower than nearly all other companies. They have board style LED grow lights as well as bar style LED grow lights. I've used both their SF2000 and SF4000 LED grow lights in the past, and I got some excellent results with them. They also have grow tents, an inline fan, and a carbon filter. I will leave a link to Spider Farmer down in the description section below, and you can use discount code MrGrowIt5 during checkout for a discount on their products. Dutch Pro Nutrients is also a sponsor of the podcast. They are a plant fertilizer company that has base nutrients, additives, and pH regulators. So everything needed for proper plant nutrition. They've been around for over 30 years, and their nutrients are available in several countries across the world. I'll be using their base nutrients that are formulated specifically for RO and soft water. They also have base nutrients formulated specifically for water that has some minerals already in it, such as well water or tap water. I'll leave a link to Dutch Pro's Amazon store down in the description section below, and you can use coupon code MrGrowIt10DP for a discount on their products. All right, now let's get into the episode. All right, we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with Vader from Ocean Grown. How you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing good. Super pumped to have you on the podcast today. We're going to be talking about breeding, the basics of breeding plants. And I couldn't think of a better person to have on the podcast for this discussion, really. I mean, you've been around forever. You know, I remember watching you in 2014, I think is when I first started watching you. And you've been around since 2011 is when your first video came out. So
yesterday, I think it was June or July 11th. So I think yesterday was 10 years on YouTube. It was the 10-year anniversary. So this is like an anniversary episode.
I was going to call that out. Congratulations. 10 years. You have 469 videos currently on your channel, over 80,000 or about to hit 80,000 subscribers. And all those videos combined have over 9.2 million views. So that's truly incredible, man. Hats off to you for really doing this for the past 10 years. It's just extensive. So great job.
It comes quick. I don't even think about the numbers most of the time, like the analytics. I know others, even people on the team and stuff, like really nerd out about the analytics. I sort of look past it and don't think about it often. Then you hear the numbers like that. You're like, well, it does sound like a lot. But just really, to me, it's just like you keep trudging, right? It's about the same work as growing, or it's the same work, you just keep going. We've had years where really active, and then there's other years where, you take a slow down, you have other things going on in life. It happens, but we're still here, and happy to still be here. I mean, we've even been through little bits, right? We've had channels deleted, and YouTube gave it back. and just really with no guidance from YouTube or anyone. So still happy to be here and putting out content when we can. There's been a lot of changes, I think, for everybody over the years, right? Even just with life, but we're still making our way. So still cruising through, and still plan on keeping it up for the time being, as long as they allow us to keep performing.
For sure. For those that don't know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into gardening?
Yeah. So, the kind of basic little story is that when I was graduate high school, stuff like that, I joined the military for different reasons, a couple of different reasons, but ended up being in the military for a couple of years, got sick, and resulted in kind of a lung and bronchial issue for myself. Was PEB'd, what you call a physical evaluation board. So they wouldn't allow me to stay because I was going to take too long to recover, and they weren't even sure if I would recover all the way. And it's pretty sick. I spent on and off a few months in the hospital at a time in full ICU. Very similar to some of the viral issues that you see people going through. At the time, I had gotten something very similar, in the sense of like that resulted in my body then producing pneumonia symptoms and all of that. So couldn't kick the virus that it was at that time. Got pneumonia over and over again, so I kept relapsing with it, and it damaged and scarred my lungs and my bronchioles. So I got bronchiectasis and lung scarring from it, and was pretty down about it. And military was like, you're not going to be coming back right now. Like, you're done. And I had gotten all the way down to like 140 pounds at one point, and that was going from like 240 pounds of, having some muscle on. So that, like, in a 6-month period, just way down, and then couldn't get weight back up. So when I got out of the military, it was about 180 pounds. And I'm 6'8", so, my average good weight is 205 to 220 at least, just to be doing pretty good. Kind of slipped below that, and I'm a little too thin. So I still had some work to get going. And they retired me, and I didn't know what to do. I was on a bunch of steroids in 2001, and just really feeling down. I had been an athlete my whole life and wasn't sure what the next step was, right? There were things like, medicinal herb that, pretty popular in the culture around Cali and everything like that, derivatives of hemp. And in that fashion, it was offered to me during the time to think about it, but I had always been an athlete, and so I'd always avoided it. Friends and people participated, at a party here and there. I had a beer, a few hops, and passed around some of that medicinal, but it never really affected me much. I was like, oh, wasn't a big deal. So I never used it, never really thought about it. And I had seen some friends that, of course, like, you get in that kind of culture, some people can abuse things really easily. And so that was always in my mindset. But got out of the military on a bunch of steroids. Doctors didn't know what to do. And a friend of mine joked about it, a little Peter Tosh, Bob Marley, right? Ha ha ha, cures asthma. And I was like, oh, I'll give it a shot. And so friend brought some over and tried it, and couldn't believe how incredibly, just immediately better I felt. Even for my lungs, things like that, even though I had scarring, you would think that it would be a no-no, especially to consume a product by inhaling and burning it. But ended up changing my life around about the viewpoint of it. And so at that time period, it was really important, especially for me, to make sure that I had clean product. Because a lot of people, especially in unregulated markets, can use, right? You're fighting a lot of weird pest issues, things like that. And so people will use products that are outside of agriculture because there's no regulation. So it was really important to me at the beginning to be able to produce my own product. And I learned that very quickly. So the one thing about that time period was that it was harder to get your medical and everything in Cali at the time. In 96, they'd opened it up. But 2001, 2002, still really difficult. Had to go to one specific specialty doctor. You had to go through a bunch of stuff, bring all your records, multiple interviews. Ended up getting a card, and ended up being able to also produce, in Cali law, you could produce for yourself as well. So along with that, I started producing for myself pretty lightly for a couple of years. And then it just kind of grew from that point on. But and I ended up falling in love with this, not only the plant itself, but plants in general, agriculture, and all kinds of medicinal plants that do come along with these concepts. Once you break your mind free of a stigma of something you've been told, then it makes you realize well, hey, if we were told this about this stuff, then what other things out there are there misconceptions for? And so that started me on a path definitely more based in agriculture a large part of my life.
Gotcha. And then you had mentioned before we started filming is that you've been breeding for over 15 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, so the first few years for sure, it was just for myself. I would just produce product or flowers and things like that to be able to make different products and try different avenues too, thinking about it because there are different ways to consume the products or make different products for it. And found, what worked for me, what I liked. And then slowly, though, more friends, because you're doing a good job of producing product, clean product, then more people would like some of it. And so I just ended up sort of growing that more and more. And because I did have the permits and everything available, I started with my card and then kind of worked my way through the system to see like, hey, in my county, in my area, what can we do? Can you bring that up more production? Had some friends thought about it. I had really gotten into the online community. So people that know, like back from the Overgrow days, that's where I initially started doing seed trading. So I started, because I saw that going on, I thought, well, if you're a farmer, like not only are you can grow something, but you also want to breed it. You also want to try participating in those future generations. A lot with like the medicinal plant that we use, you can propagate these plants through cloning. And so that's super popular. And it was super popular in our community and in Cali and in that industry, as we'd quote unquote call it. But I still, you had to even get different kinds of phenotypes, different kinds of unique clones. You could have things that people had found, but you could also make your own. And so that's what started me on the journey. And I started small by just using what they call feminized breeding, where you take a plant and you hermaphrodite it, and then you'll use pollen against another particular strain style, and then you'll get something unique out of those progeny or offspring. So that was my original sort of tiptoe in from maybe 2002 to 2006, taking things, breeding them, finding clones, and then releasing those clones into the market and slowly running a sort of clone market business as well. And it wasn't really for like producing seeds. That didn't come until later by being able to share seeds with other people, maybe with friends, and of course seed trading online. That's where we were all doing it. And there was nothing wrong with it. It's just hemp seed, right? Still a derivative of the same species stuff. So there being no cannabinoids, things like that, that had regulation towards them, especially for like us in the US. Then that was our way that we could get around that without having like live plants or live product and things. Even though in our areas it was regulated and legal, at least on a state or county levels.
Okay. So let's start with some of the basic terminology, starting with what exactly is breeding.
So when it comes to breeding, there's you're basically making offspring, right? In nature, we've got that with animals and with plants. With animals, it can be a little bit different, obviously a little bit more complicated. With plants, it's going to be, I generally call it a little simpler. You could argue theoretically a few different vantage and viewpoints for it, depending especially the species. But overall, it's pretty much simpler in the sense that for plants, you have monoecious and dioecious or dioecious. I kind of get some people say it's tomato sometimes. But these are the difference between plants that have either both sex organs on themselves. So technically they can self-pollinate themselves, although they generally will pollinate at different times. So you take like maize, corn. It tries to have its male parts and pollen come at a different time than its female parts on its particular plant. So another corn or maize will be flowering its female parts at a time at which one near it will be flowering male parts. So it tries not to pollinate itself so much and then send it off to other things, although technically can pollinate. But they have both organs. And then dioecious, right, you're going to have two different male and female plants. Now, some people get that confused with like hemp because hemp can show those traits. But actually, genetically, it's a little bit of a difference. It would be considered a dioecious plant. So it has both males and females, which was something really interesting for me to learn at the time, because when I first learned about it, I actually thought all plants, and especially flowers and things of those species that are near there, like on the taxonomy when it comes to botany, they all were males and or male female parts would be on one plant. So it was interesting to me, and that was kind of like the joke at the beginning. It's like, oh, it's an alien plant because, you know, there's true like males and true females, until I learned more about agriculture and botany, and then it turned out like, oh no, you do find this around quite a lot. So it's just that you get two separations. For that, for us, then we have two different sets. We're going for females and males, and that's the baseline of breeding, which we call true breeding, or many people refer to as regular. In our particular industry or community with our plants.
And then getting into, I think it's appropriate to talk about genotype and phenotype. Now, this is something that I had briefly talked about in a recent past podcast with Northwest J. We talked about phenohunting. We described what it is there, but I think it's appropriate to talk about it here as well in this episode. Can you break down genotype and phenotype for us?
Phenos are going to be what your progeny persist on. So you'll have different phenotypic expressions per traits. The genotype itself is the larger genomics of a plant. So and phenotypes are kind of, we throw it around a lot, I think, in like, oh, this is the phenotype of the plant. But what you're really talking about when you get a progeny and it's a phenotype of it, meaning it's showing a phenotypical trait. So let's say color purple. Right? You know, even though something like color purple comes from really stress and it comes from mutations for that. But let's say you're just going for color and you want something. So you get a progeny that has something, offspring that has purple in it. You would call it a purple phenotype, but it's really just displaying that particular trait. It's not the whole thing itself. It's actually only just the miniature traits versus the genotype, which is the whole thing in general for that species, if that makes sense.
Yep, that makes sense. And so kind of taking a step back just to kind of make things basic for the beginners for introduction, male plants are going to produce the pollen sacs. And they're going to release, the pollen sacs will open and release pollen. Females grow pistils and receive the pollen through that, ultimately forming a seed within the plant's buds. Now there are different generations, F1, F2, F3, et cetera, et cetera. What is an F1?
So, that nomenclature is when you take two different kids or two different things in a species and put it together. So it can still breed, right? Like it's still the same technical species. I mean, it gets a little different because you talk about like things like animals are easy to show, like lions and tigers are obviously different, but they're close enough that they can breed together. And then they're at the same time kind of far enough away from each other that when you breed them together, you get weird things going on, right? Everything from sterility to gigantism and all kinds of funky stuff. So they've gotten away, pretty far away, but they're not super close. Where if you're talking about a species like for us, where we're using our plants, we're so close that we can move into the same downward spiral is really within the same thing. So like humans, like we're all so similar that you can just mix us, like our idea that hair is a certain way or skin or different things. They're really similar. They're small little changes. To us, they look like they might be a wide variety of stuff, but really genetically we are so similar that these traits are just well within the same species. So that's where like F1s and things, talking about just hybridization, because all of our plants are hybridized itself. And so you can take one that's purple and one that's green and put them together, and then that'll be your F1 on that. And then your F2s, your F3s, traits down, these are filial breeding. Generally what you're going to do is an offspring and progeny, you'll have two parents, and then if you F1s are going to be two separate parents, right, from two different zones. Maybe they're on two different sides of the valley. Okay, they've been developing far enough away from each other, but they're like two different tribes, north side and south side. So that is the F1, north and south side together. Then their progeny, their offspring, if you take a brother and a sister and you breed them together because north side and south side had two different traits, purple and green, then, and you want to get more purple, then so first thing you'll do is F2. You'll take a sister and a brother, you'll put them together, and that'll be your F2, and then F3 on the next sister brother, and that's filial breeding all the way down. Sister brother, just straight. Eventually, you can back yourself into corners, generally with like hemp and stuff. It's pretty well known. You get to like F16, somewhere F12 to F16, and generally you'll get to sterility. And probably some funky genetic traits, weird growth patterns, all kinds of stuff in between there. So you can only go so far without F1ing again, meaning taking something out of that lineup and resetting it back to something a little bit different. So that's where you get those. Backcrosses would be backcrossing to, if we move into that, right, which is really popular, and that's where it's much quicker to get to a trait. So you can easily backcross by meaning you did an F1, and then you got something purple. And the North original parent lineage was also purple. So you take a purple child and you backcross that to the purple parent. And then you'll take a purple grandkid and change that back to the original parent again. So then you get down to like BX4, where you're like 4 generations down, but you still keep going back up to your original parent, which is your 0 or your P1s. So that's where you get into like back crossing. And then you get into self crossing, which is because with like hemp, for example, even though it has males and females, we have been able to breed it, and it was showing it in nature and naturally, where it will throw both male and female parts. Unfortunately, this happens with both plant styles, even monoecious or dioecious, that when you self, the pollen from itself adds in extra chromosomes. So that's where you get like X or Y, XX, things like that. So then when you get your future progeny, they're not what we call true breed, where they'll just have XY and XX. Which is why it can get a little confusing when people go to test for sex with the sex testing, because the sex tests check for Y. So you could say like, oh, this is a Y, it's a male, but it might actually be a YXX, right, or XXY. So you're catching the Y, thinking it's male, but really it's going to, if you grew it out, it would look female. And if you didn't give it any stress, it wouldn't show any of its like hermaphroditic traits. It wouldn't show its selfing traits. So that's just something to think about, that chromosomes and those things aren't all equal in the way. That becomes like very advanced, right? Concepts and things get a little, so without digressing into weird theoretical or other concepts, just keeping it simple, getting into selfing, S1, S2 can be really viable in a lot of situations and help hybridize. So it's another technique that you can use in speed against filial crossing, which always takes much longer to pull the traits out, especially when two things are vastly different. So if you take something like a plant that was from the equatorial zone, in Colombia, and then you want to go breed that against something that was natural in nature, very close in the species, but it was over in Northern Europe, then it's going to be far more hybridized, right? Your progeny are going to be way more varied. Where if you take something from equatorial Colombia, and then you take something that was over in Peru, and you put those together, they're going to be much closer. You're still going to call them an F1 when you breed them together. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be so similar, because maybe they had some crossing back and forth between the days earlier. They can be much more stable in a sense as far as like a monoculture crop. But you'll still call them F1s and F2s. So it's something to think about when people hear like, oh, this is an F1, I want to stay away from those, or this is an F2. Well, something that's so hybridized nowadays, especially in our industry and community, most of the time we've hybridized everything so much that when we F1 things, there's still so many traits that are similar that they're going to work well together, and you may not see as much variety. And then you just have to get to know your breeds. But that's why, in the 70s, 80s, there was a lot more varied production. But over the years, of course, we're all just interacting with each other and passing around plants and genetics, that we've really come to a place where we've gotten away from a lot of those extreme. You don't find those as much anymore because the production has moved itself all around the world.
Gotcha. And for the record, I am not a breeder. I just want to make that clear. I did create a cross. I did VaderOG cross with Pakistan Valley.
Then you are a breeder.
I'm learning so much from this conversation here. The short 20 minutes that we've already been recording, I've learned so much. So I don't consider myself a breeder at all. Or if you consider me a breeder, I'm a breeder with barely any experience.
Yeah, in experience levels, but same with myself. And I'm sure that somewhere in here, somebody who has, a particular level of education will catch me on saying things that, right? Like, you're always going to do that. Even myself, like, I'm pretty well up with it. I can handle it with the best. I have friends who are PhD, right? Like, they straight up, I can hang with them and know a lot of concepts, but at the same time, I don't always get the terms and everything right. And I think that's important to note, and even for someone like you, as you're getting into it, don't get hung up on it. If you kind of messed up on a term or something, or even a concept, as long as you have the baseline of it, like that's a great beginning. Like you just keep working on it, you learn from new people. But even I myself learn all the time. So, but you're on that path, and it is well to call yourself. If you've started breeding, then you're a breeder. Like that's, to me, that's the same place. You're participating in something that most people don't participate when it comes to plants and farming just in general.
That's a really good point, for sure. Okay, let's hop into the selection process. So, oftentimes breeders, they're going to select certain males or females. We'll start with males. They look at certain characteristics in the plant, things that they're looking for that they want to breed within that cultivar. So talking about the male selection process, what are some characteristics that you look for when you're selecting males?
Yeah, when it comes to these kinds of things, I've always erred. So it kind of depends on whether you know your particular strains or not, right? If you're in one species of a plant. Once you know your strains more, you can make a variety of decisions based on that, but always starting really simply, like just in a basic level, you want to get into it. I always lean into recommending that you go for health. Go for the health of the males, and you don't worry about trying to get into the nitty-gritty of figuring out what traits they're going to pass on. You're going to be able to tell that, especially like in our field with the females. It's the more prized possession. It's what people are going for. So you concentrate more on what the females are displaying and not what the males are displaying, because what you're going to get into is dominant and recessive traits. So you could pick a male, for example, that is showing purple. But when you breed it with a female that has purple-green, and then all the progeny just turn out green. That is because there is a dominant trait, right, that is going to grasp on and it comes in ones and twos or zeros and ones, and that dominant trait is going to overtake the recessive trait. It's just the way it works. So you'll run into that all the time with breeding. So that is why I say at the beginning, you worry about health of the plants, things like that, strength, and stay away from worrying about the traits themselves as much when it comes to the males. The females are much easier to identify the traits, and then when you breed with them, you'll be able to then keep picking those females that display those traits. And then, of course, you can start doing with the males themselves, colors, for hemp and things like that when it comes to like trichomes and stuff, and production. Then that will lend itself over. And it will. If you start picking purple males that are real sticky, right, and you want stickier flowers on your females, it's going to lend itself over, and you're going to find the more dominant traits for it. But I always say get to know your plants first before worrying about the specific traits, because of those dominant and recessive genes are going to be more powerful. And you're going to find the visualization of being able to choose that and understanding your plants under females much quicker and easier. Males are a little harder to kind of wrap your brain. You don't see them a lot. You don't deal with them a lot. And they will display different traits depending on what strain line they come down. And I know that from experience that certain strain lines, I'm not worried about if a male's tall. It's always a recessive trait with the particular females I'm running. So I don't care if he gets super lanky. It doesn't really bother me that much. I mean, I don't want it extremely lanky, but it does. I will pick a lankier male that is purple over a male that I don't want it getting too lanky, so I'll get it a little bit more green because I just don't want to keep the height down. So you have to figure that out. That's kind of that artistry experience that comes in play, and that's the hard part about time. Then time comes into play in the experience. So shooting for males that are healthy, strong, that's the best way to go at first, because that will always bring up the health and vigor of all of your strains and all the progeny from that point on, even with females, because we hybridize stuff so much, and so many people in the industry end up getting seeds from stressed out situations. Things didn't go just perfect. Maybe you're breeding against clones that have been around a long time, and they have slowly had epigenetic drift, as we call it. So epigenetic wise, they've been exposed to different environments and different stressors, and that has changed their genetics. So just like a twin, even with humans, you take two twins and one of them grows up well, super healthy, and the other one is malnourished growing up, you're going to get that particular exact clone, in a sense, right? That identical twin, to one be displaying different traits even later on in their life. They could have displayed either trait, right? of being a little hunched back or being standing up straight, for example, but due to those stressors. So when it comes to clones, a lot of times, and even seed batches as people are doing, we sort of end up defaulting down into things not being as healthy. And one of the easiest ways to bring up the health of stuff is just to pick for healthier plants in the beginning.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if that kind of makes sense in that realm, I just say start soft, start simple.
Gotcha. Now, when I first grew out a male, I was really surprised by not only how fast those pollen stacks grew, but how fast they opened up. So I think it was like around day 20 or something, pollen stacks were open up and pollen was going everywhere. Around what day of flower do you feel it's best to kind of harvest pollen or collect pollen from males in order to kind of maximize the amount of pollen you're getting? Because some people are there, let me back up a second. So there's some people that are actually collecting the pollen, storing it, and using it later. And then there's some people who are just putting a male in with a female and shaking it. So as far as like people who are collecting it, what day of flower is best, do you think, to kind of harvest that pollen?
In my experience, there's no difference between pollen that is just being released and pollen that's on a male that's been opening pollen up for a couple of weeks. The viability and strength of that pollen, the genetics that they're passing on is exactly the same. They're just doing it at different rates. They're growing up, the first stamens are coming out, they're starting to drop pollen for the males. The wind, with like hemp, for example, like, you don't even need a pollinator like bees or anything like that, right? You just, the wind will just take care of it. So if you're in a chamber or something, that'll just all on its own. Get off into the environment and the females will grab it. If you're collecting, then you don't have to worry about it. You can just do it right at the beginning, get enough pollen, and you can nuke that male, and you don't have to keep it around. You don't have to waste time on it or anything like that. So if you're just doing pollen collection, then collect as much as you need right at the beginning, and then you can move on. It will not change the strength or any of the traits by letting the males go longer. They're just going to keep producing pollen to get more females, because plants grow at different rates, especially in nature. So the plants know, they're like, hey, males drop pollen from, they start opening up every 2 or 3 weeks, right? Usually by week 3, males are totally blooming, and then they're going to bloom until week 5 or 6, and then they'll almost die off themselves. Like after they've spent, males are just like, brah, and then they're down. You won't even see them last, which is why we usually say, even if you're doing chambers or something, you can cut off your males after week 5 or week 6 and not even worry about it. And then once the males are cut out of the situation, then the females will put a lot more production into, okay, I'm not getting any more male pollen. Like now I'm really going to put that production into the seeds and the embryos.
Okay, and then as far as like the collecting process, I've done it a couple different ways. I put a bag over the actual branch and shook it so the pollen gets collected in a bag. Cutting it off, bashing it down onto like tin foil and then scraping it up is another way. Using one of those like trim trays, that has a screen on it, bashing it down there so all the pollen comes down below. I found that to be kind of the best way. What techniques do you use to collect pollen?
Yeah, so your biggest thing for collecting pollen, because pollen is going to go inert really quickly if it dries up. And that's one thing to note also with males, just as like a side tangent, which is like if you have a male and it dries up or the pollen dries up, it's going to go inert within like 72 hours. If it dries, it'll be dead. It won't matter. You can see the little yellow pollen around, on the edges, but if it's dried up and gone, it's gone. And it won't be pollinating anything else anymore. So you want to throw that into a cool environment, right? I'm guessing you either did fridge or freeze the pollen.
Yeah, I put it in the fridge, and that was another question I was going to ask you: is the best way to store pollen?
Yeah, so cooling it down and keeping the moisture level, that's basically what's going on with the fridge, and cooling it, and then you'll get 6 months or so out of it. Often, getting into longer period freezing, then you need to freeze it. And then normal fridges work okay. You're lucky to get a year and a half out of that pollen. You'll need to get into like minus 80 environments to be able to store pollen for longer periods of time. And then, of course, anytime you freeze it, because we all know this, water expands, just like a human being, or, you put water in a glass inside your freezer, the ice expands, breaks the glass. Same things happen with cells. So when you go to dethaw stuff, if it wasn't frozen quickly enough, it can actually, like, the expansion will happen. And when you go to dethaw, it will create more problems with moisture and damage the pollen itself. So it's the dethaw process that ends up being hard, which is why, if you want to be able to kind of move into a similar round, like on the next round, you're going to use that pollen on the next round, but you just want to save it for a couple months, then just throwing it in the fridge is generally a better idea. One of the things you want to do for oxidization or oxidization and everything is that you want to get the air out, as much air, and getting out enough particles. So like you're saying, putting it over a screen and just getting the pollen itself and keeping out a lot of the larger cell structure, the stamens and leaf matter and things like that, is going to help in that storage process without inviting any other, because there's molds and fungi and everything like that floating around, bacteria floating around, and those bacteria and everything and fungi will eat away and start in the dethaw process, or even inside the fridge, right? So you want to cool it down enough where you don't promote that kind of warmer situation where you'll get like fungi and things to grow, and keep it nice and clean. So screening it, getting it into a container of some kind, and then getting the air out, which is why I'm more of a fan of, whether you get it onto a plate or tinfoil like you were saying, or whatever different techniques are, and you kind of shake some and you scoop it up with a little spoon, get it into, you can put it into vials, things like that, but it's harder to get the oxygen out. Where with like a little baggie, you can, if you store them in bags, you can even just kind of press the air out, right? And just get most of the air out, and then that will help with long-term storage. So getting the air out and then keeping the natural moisture level it was at cooled down, then you're going to create a good environment for that pollen to stay moist enough where it's viable, but doesn't degrade and doesn't also get eaten away at some kind of pest.
Good info. Really good info there. Let's move on to the female selection process. So we talked about males. Now let's talk about females. So you said it was a little bit different of a process when you're selecting females. How do you select females? What's your process?
The nice thing about females is that you kind of like, and I still lend myself away. And again, different people can have different techniques. I encourage people to have different techniques for what they do. So just because I do something a certain way doesn't mean it's the right way to go about it or do it. Because I have such a heavy background in creating clones, trying to find specific traits that are expressed and finding unique things, then I will hunt, or what we call pheno hunt out females, and then use those as my base line. Now, whether I get into filial breeding or I just use backcrossing quite a bit, and that lends itself really well for like our particular like medicinal style hemp breeding and stuff, that for females I generally go to hunt for what I would want to run as a monocrop. I find something that would be great to run just as propagation for clones. So you clone a bunch and then you run a whole tray or a whole room just in that one crop. So I'll find things that to me are something I would love to grow in larger production, and then we'll take that as our baseline and then use that either for filial crossing, F1 style crossing and hybridization, or we'll use it for back crossing into future generations to try and stabilize those traits into being, when you grow the seeds out, hopeful, or eventually if you get it right, you can get those seeds to basically what they call stable. Not to be confused with, I know the terminology a lot, people are like, oh, they're stable, like as if they're stable against hermaphroditic traits, which is true. It can be stable against hermaphroditic traits, but the word stable, when it comes to saying seeds are stable, means that they come out like a monoculture, that 99% of the traits that they display, that the girls are displaying, they almost look like clones. That would be stability, or true stability. So we're getting closer to stability and a lot quicker with back crossing. So start with some baseline thing, and then you're back crossing to those. You'll end up getting down, as long as you don't run into some weird odd mutation, and everything's pretty healthy, then you can get those seeds by BX4, BX5. There's some nuances in there and some things that we do see depending on what backcross generation it is and depends on the particular strain line. But usually by BX6 or so, you should have a pretty stable run of just seeds. And then so now you have seeds in the same way you could produce just those clones by propagating. But the nice thing about seeds, unlike clones, is that seeds can stay viable for years with just some decent storage and still get perfect propagation. So then it just kind of depends on, what way in agriculture do you want to hold moms, clones, or seeds, things like that.
Okay. And when it comes to the actual pollination process, right? I feel like if you're trying to pollinate a female too early, you could mess things up. If it's too late, you could kind of mess things up as far as like your overall yield on seeds, or however you want to say it. Around what day of flower would you suggest, what do you think is like the best day to pollinate?
So I'm a big believer in nature, and for how many seeds the plants produce for the average person going into this, you are going to get so many seeds that you should never really worry about trying to do what we call seed production runs, where you'll purposely grow the females out till like week 3 before even setting a male into flowering. So that way, by the time the male opens up and starts producing pollen at his week 3, the females are, say, at week 6. And we all know that a 6-week-old female is going to have a lot more flower sites, a lot more pistils, a lot more calyx sites to be able to absorb pollen, and you're going to be able to get more seed out of it. To me, it depends on the strain, and 2, it's kind of negligible. I mean, there are so many seeds that it's not really that much more production to me. I think that would be something I would talk to when it comes to production for facilities, when facilities are trying to do it. So if I were counseling that, then we could start getting into the nuance with particular strains. But even when you're first breeding and you just want to keep things natural, again, back to the healthy and strong thing. If you put males in with the females, they know that. They are sending out signals to each other, right? They're picking that up, and the females will grow. Just with a male in the vicinity, you will see them grow slightly differently because they know that there's a male there, and they are bumping themselves up getting ready for it. The other way is that they want to get seeded, and so they'll start putting out, and we can smell it in terpenes, right? The females will start putting a lot of production into like trying to basically be sexy. And that, to me, lends itself more to like they want to get seeds in, and you can get a lot of production. But I find healthier, better phenotypes from females that like had a male and they were ready to go right at the same time period. Because in nature, the males are going to grow in a field with the females randomly or in the same environment under the same lighting system, lighting times, or photo period times, excuse me. So they're going to get the same basic signals from those environmental conditions to start up their production on whether or not they're going to be getting seed or not getting seed. So I think it stresses out the females a little bit more when you hold that back from them. And it's fine when we're just using the female flower product, and that's what we're getting it for. We're using it for a specific thing. We've bred them to have these big fat flowers, for example, right? Or same with cucumbers and stuff. We've bred them to get real big and not have any seeds. Bananas, examples, etc. So you kind of have to look past like what we've done for breeding and what not, and what's really stressing the plant out. And overall, that is a stress. So getting the males in early when you're just trying to find the best things is always my recommendation, is what I go for, is just let the males get in there naturally, because the females are still going to produce more than enough seed, even when you're doing production on a personal level. I find that to be the best way. And then also logistically, it just makes it much easier. So everything kind of lines itself up to just like get the males in with the females and let them have a party.
That makes sense. I was going to ask you about yield. Now, generally speaking, I mean, you can veg a plant out and fill up like a 4x4 space and then pollinate that plant. And you're going to get a lot more seeds than you would a smaller plant, right? So kind of generally speaking, do you have a recommended size plant to pollinate, and like roughly how many seeds can potentially be yielded from that size?
Yeah, of course, again, strains, or as you're kind of like pointing, like strains are going to dependent, I mean, how big they are. Different ones do it. It's just like female, just when you're even going for flower production, for that kind of thing, with like total sensimilla, no seeds, right? Different strains are going to lend themselves to different training techniques. Obviously, with breeding, you start getting a male into say something like a chamber, then you're not going to be able to train them out as well. You're going to get to a point where if they're locked in a chamber, you can't get in there and like strip down certain fan leaves and still try and promote certain kinds of growth. It's going to be a little bit more difficult challenge unless you're doing the pollen collection, going to do bagging of certain branches. But even then, if you're doing that kind of technique, well, you're not going for tons of seed. You're just trying to get enough seed variety out that you can go and experiment and find some different phenotypes.
Okay. Gotcha. Let's get into feminized seeds. So becoming more and more popular, right? You have regular seeds, which they can end up being a male plant or a female plant. You have feminized seeds, which are supposed to be always female. That doesn't happen, but they're supposed to be. So how would feminized...
They're supposed to be displaying just their female traits. So that's what they're attempting to do, is get them there. Now, hemp itself has a natural mutation somewhere along the line. We don't know exactly where. Like, we have been going in and out of production for hemp for thousands of years. And there are things that, like in the 60s and 70s, when all the hippies went out and found all the crazy stuff that was still out and around or near farms in, Vietnam or somewhere, and some of them were wild. Well, they weren't really wild. If we look back in the genetics of these plants, we can tell that they had gone through some kind of selection process and humans were involved in moving them towards different kinds of traits in those areas. So it is a crop that we have had our hands in for a long time, even when it has gone back to wild. They do display these traits of what we call hermaphrodite, right? Traits, where they will, just like plants that just have male and female parts, they'll kind of do the same thing. So we can basically leverage that trait, this hermaphroditic trait, and this is where we get into, even those females, though, will still have chromosomes that are displaying both. XX, Y. So both an X and a Y chromosomes. This is why if you give them a little bit of a stress, they're much more likely to show those traits. But even the males and females that you get in true breeding still have this stress trait in their genetics. And most likely from the nature, we can imagine, you get to the fall time, a female's there, self-preservation, there were no males to pollinate it. At the end, it'll pollinate itself. Frost is coming. It'll throw out some male sacs. Pollen will come. It'll pollinate itself. And at least it'll keep that thing going into the next year, the next season after the frost or whatever it is, wherever that environment is. So that's where we can theoretically imagine that that's where that trait comes from. And so we're trying to leverage that trait by then producing plants that will only show female flowers, a trait for only displaying female flowers, and we don't have to worry about that. So that's where we get into the feminized breeding. That's why it works that way. And it works great if you're super healthy and you're super good about your selection. Then you can absolutely feminize, as we call it, like this branding term, into seeds. Unfortunately, a lot of people and a lot of breeders and places just don't take the time to, one, make the proper selection to get down, to make sure that they're stress tested, everything like that. And it takes a lot of time. It's one of the reasons I stay away from it. I've done a lot of that for pheno hunting, to go find strains out of clones and to make clones, because you can find a clone out of feminized seeds, right, that has all the traits you want, doesn't show the hermaphroditic traits, is really strong, and so that's easy to pick. So I don't have to go that far down in fem breeding to find good clones and then be able to then maybe add some males back in there, rehybridize out the genetics, kind of get it reset, but still grab those traits that are dominant mostly for those particular strains. In other places, though, if you give them the stress, people may see in their environment, they smashed, two females together, and one of them they hermaphrodited for feminized seeds, made fem seeds. In their environment, it seemed fine. They didn't get any hermaphrodite traits, but then tons of people are reporting back that they share those seeds with, that they're having issues. And so that's where you run into this issue over and over again, where sometimes people love fem seeds, they never have any problems, it's all great, good breeding was done, great selection was done. And then in other places, it wasn't. Maybe even good selection was done, but in their environment. So you have to really expose them to a lot of different environments to be able to figure out whether or not those traits will be expressed. Where for myself, I stick to a lot of true breeding, because even if those are in strains that we use, those kinds of traits, they definitely aren't displayed as much, and they seem to be healthier and be able to get through a lot more stressful situations by having the variety in that genetics, especially with the way that we've hybridized the entire species itself so much.
That's really interesting. So you touched on how feminized seeds are created. Autoflowers, another popular type of seed or plant. How are those seeds created?
So autoflowers come from part of the species, the taxonomy for that, right, is that is a ruderalis. So it is related to hemp, or is hemp, but it is started going off in a different path, like a lion and a tiger. So they're farther away from each other. versus like if you go and look at lions or even killer whales, like for example, there's two different kinds of killer whales. There's like the northern hemisphere ones that hang out, and then there's the lower hemisphere ones. And to us, by eye, you might not notice a difference, but actually, if you study them, they've sort of started to bridge away from each other. And one is smaller than the other. One have a little bit different social interactions, etc. But they're not totally different with something they can't breed. So same with lions, right? Like lions can be that way too. You think like all lions are the same, but actually there's some different depending on the zones and where they are. Like in say Africa, for example, where lions are in different places, environments, they've gone away from each other. But you take those lions back together, and they're still lions versus a tiger, which is all the way out. So I look at like ruderalis as like a tiger. You get into breeding that with what we've made selection for so long on our production that we've had a lot of hand in. You're going back to something that has a slightly different genetic makeup. Now, autoflowers are in zones, and they were pulled in a place where they will flower automatically regardless of your photoperiod. So photoperiod doesn't affect them. That's the trait that comes along with them. So the advantage of that, of course, is that if you pop a seed, it will vegetate itself up no matter the light. You could give it 24 hours of light. It'll do that for 3-4 weeks, and then it'll just start flowering. And you can leave it on 24 hours of light, and it'll keep flowering. So that is a great trait for somebody to be able to just, throw a plant in their backyard or on a porch or something, and it makes a lot of sense. You don't have to worry about photoperiods. The issue with this is that it's really hard to get, again, we're back to dominant and recessive traits, to be able to pull in the traits. So if the progeny or the offspring, you breed with it with a ruderalis male, for example, this is just, it could be a female or male, but we'll just say a ruderalis male, and you take it against your favorite at-home medicinal strain. Some of those progeny are going to come out ruderalis or autoflower, and some of the progeny won't. It will depend on what's dominant or recessive. Now, some of the traits with a particular strain, maybe a bunch of them come out ruderalis, and a bunch of them don't come out ruderalis. And that's where you have to do the breeding to get it in. In my experience with ruderalis, because of the genetics and the way it's been worked, it's really tough to get like flavor profiles, color, etc., structure, because that you love out of your photoperiod plant into an autoflower plant, because the dominant traits for autoflower may always go against it being purple, for example. So sure, all the progeny, you can get them all down to being all ruderalis after a couple of generations of breeding or a few generations. But to get it down to all them being ruderalis, you'll never get the purple. It'll always be recessive against. And that's just one example of something that you could and will run into when breeding with that. Versus if you do feminized seeds, right, and you self something or self it against another, or at least put male hermaphrodite pollen onto a female, all those seeds are going to be that way. So it's much easier to get to. You won't see that with feminized seeds, right? Well, it's not like with feminized seeds, some of them turn out to be male and some of them turn out to be female. No, they're all going to majority-wise show that female trait. But when it comes to ruderalis, you're talking about something completely different. So then you really have to worry about the recessive and dominant genes to get that. And that's where you get that battle where some people are like, oh, I ordered ruderalis seeds, and like a couple of them were, but most of them weren't even that. And they're just regular photoperiod plants. And that's because the work wasn't done to make sure that you got those traits along with it and to stabilize it. So back to stabilizing a particular strain, which is going to be much more important when doing autoflowering and autoflower breeding, to stabilize everything, especially for that particular trait, because that's the trait you're looking for.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask you, there's more and more people reaching out to me saying that they got autos, but they're not actually autos. And I honestly feel bad. It seems to be the same breeders. First, number one, I won't expose anybody in this video, but, a lot of these home growers, they just have one space to grow in. And if you've got a plant that's not actually an auto and you need to flip it to 12-12, what do you do? Like, there's a lot of people that are they're stuck at that point. So, you touched on how that can actually happen. So it's just, they're not stabilizing and so on and so forth. It's just, it's sad to see some of that stuff. It kind of seems like things are rushed in a sense just to get it out onto the market, So.
And, that And that's the age-old problem. Even before Ruderalis, Autoflower had become really popular over the last years, 10, 15 years, and it's really taken off. That's the same problem, right, we get with feminized seeds, where people get complaints like, oh, well, everything's hermaphroditing at week 6. I can't even make it past week 6. And then suddenly it's showing its trait that normally would show at week 12 or something in like a normal true female. It would still throw that hermaphroditic trait show to try and self-pollinate itself under stress. But instead, it's overtaken, and now you can't even get past week 6 with those progeny without it flipping over. And then also kind of a fun note about plants, just so some people, just to kind of get in your idea in your head, when it comes to true breed, you can also do this to males. So you can take a male and stress it out and run it long enough, and it will throw female pistils and flowers and seed itself. And all of your seeds that come from that male will be maleized. They will majority show the male trait and come out as males. But then they'll be throwing female pistils and things. So if you see that in your males and everything, then you know, like, okay, this somewhere along the line, this has kind of ended up happening. And it happens with tons of strains I've run across, because I, too, standing on the shoulders of giants, am working with gear, right? Like, even if it was a long time ago, at some point I started with gear that I have no idea what the history is of it. I'm told of certain things. I can try and look it up from the names and from where it comes from in that time period, but you never quite know where along the path something happened. But that's kind of a fun, weird thing about like feminized breeding, is that it also goes the other way too.
Super interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's really interesting. Cool. Well, we can go on and on and on and on, but we're gonna wrap things up here. Can you tell us how the listeners can find you and what you've got upcoming in the future?
Oh yeah, we're in California. I have run a company called Ocean Grown for quite some time. The best way to find us is we either run on our Discord, or you can just go to our website. It's purely educational site, no issues with that. You can find information about where to find different kinds of products or what the available producers are. And then I also have a YouTube channel that I've been running, as we mentioned. It's just VaderOG, or you can type in Vader Vision. It's kind of like the show that I run through that production. So over on YouTube, you can find me there, and some resource videos available. And then if you want to talk to us, though, or even get a hold of me a little bit more, you have questions about things in the community, our Discord has been, I used to be big on forums. So I loved forums, and that's where you used to be able to find me, but I've gone away from that with the newer technology into a much more simpler platform that allows a lot more access. So even if you can't just talk to me, you can talk to people in the team that are going to be able to help you out. So over at our Discord, Ocean Grown Discord.
And then also you've got a podcast that you're a part of now, huh? You want to talk a little bit about that? Growers Workshop?
Oh, we've started running a podcast, yes, for Growers Workshop. We used to get the community together. We used to have a show, GrowTube, a lot of people know, and that was great to be able to get a lot of people in our particular community together. That is still there to a degree, although we've kind of stepped away from it. We had some issues with YouTube and banning channels and deleting things. So this time around, very similarly, we have created a podcast where we can talk about these subjects, but keep them available for information, that YouTube is not going to remove it. So we tried to start this podcast where we can still talk a little bit more openly, but with the right nomenclature, the right language to express the information out there. So Growers Workshop is the podcast we've been running, and then there is some idea and plans for also that's where we've been putting like build out stuff, chambers, things. So for people who want to like be able to do breeding, and you want to be able to have a chamber area that is going to be good enough not to let pollen out and pollinate, some females and stuff right nearby. And this can work for orchids and all kinds of stuff. But these, that is a great place also to find that kind of information. And it's more grow wide. And same with, I do like permaculture. We do hydroponics outdoors for veggies, for all kinds of other things. So that kind of stuff is also a resource for those looking to do that kind of stuff. But it's slowly building. It's new. So if you go over there and it doesn't seem like there's too much information, we're new venture that we're working through.
Cool. I will link Vader's channel down in the description section below, and also the Growers Workshop. I'll link that channel down in the description section below. If you enjoyed this video, please click that thumbs up button. The thumbs up button helps so much. It helps us reach more people. Also subscribing. If you are new to the channel, hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Every single week, every Saturday, I release a new episode. Unless Susan decides she needs to manually review it, then it usually comes out on Sunday. But typically every weekend we have a new episode out. Apple Podcasts, if you're listening on there, please leave a rating and review. We have 79 so far, so we're getting real close to 100. Thank you to everyone who has left a rating or review on Apple Podcasts so far. And lastly, sharing this. So sharing this is probably one of the best things that you can do. Reddit is a big area you can share it. Facebook groups, there are a lot of Facebook groups that you can share it on. Thank you to everyone who shares this podcast. So, Vader, thank you so much for coming onto this podcast. It's truly been an honor. I'm so thankful for you to come on here. And thanks to Dago. He's the one who kind of connected us to make this happen. Got to give him a shout out. So
absolutely. Thanks for having me on. And of course, and for anyone listening, drop questions on whatever platform you're watching it on. I'm sure I will rotate back through. I can get into more detail. I can even be prepared with some research if somebody brings up something theoretical or just something that they want to know about. It's really tough in these kinds of podcasts to keep it within an hour or 45 minutes because I can tangent really quick into other kinds of concepts. So keeping that kind of baseline. So hopefully we knocked out the beginner stuff, but absolutely get down in there and ask away, and I will definitely rotate back through. I had a wonderful time.
Absolutely. Well, Vader, thanks again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Absolutely. You too. I'll see you soon.
Peace.